Fantastic. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our typical Saturday session on Aucademy. I am Dr. Chloe Farahar, and as a visual description of myself, I am a white woman with a shaved head, large glasses, kind of wearing my partner's kimono. I don't know what you call this shirt, sitting in my office. I'm joined today by Angela Kelly. If you wouldn't mind describing yourself.
Yeah, I am a white woman. I have shoulder lengthish sort of brown hair. I'm wearing narrow glasses and a kind of summery top, which I'm going to regret probably after this interview's finished.
Why would you regret it? Because it's chilly, did you say?
It's going to be chilly.
Ah, I see. Okay. Oh no. And feel free if you need to go like grab a or something. So hello, lovely people who are here already. So today's session is on basically autistic people, trauma, and accessing therapy. I did actually ask in a couple of groups if anyone had any questions that we could have ahead of time. So I've got 4 questions that we're also going to put to Angela and have a discussion about. But largely that's what we're discussing. So as our typical first question that we ask of all our guests, if you could explain who are you and what is or are your dedicated interests?
So I am Angela Kelly. I'm a therapist. I trained nearly 10 years ago now. Crikey. Goes really quick, the time. My main special interest probably is autism and research and learning and reading. I love it. I can lose myself completely in reading. And
specifically autistic or autism based stuff, or reading very broadly, fiction?
I do read a little bit of fiction, but it has to have a good kind of subject for me to want to read it. I prefer reading non-fiction. That's more of a favourite of mine, and I like learning about people and about the psychology of people, really. Why they do things, why they say things, why have they said it that way, why not another way. So,
and interestingly, I think lots of autistic people, even if we don't end up in as a therapist and so on, not all of us, but a lot of us are interested in that, like trying to work out people. So can I ask, when did you discover you were autistic?
I think I've known for quite a long time, but actually officially decided to go for a non-medical diagnosis, and that happened in December 2020. So not that long ago, really. But I had suspected for a very, very long time. I've got 2 autistic boys anyway, so it definitely, I knew.
And again, that's why I find it interesting that, to be honest, whether we're late discovered or discovered earlier in our lives, that connection between us potentially going into interests or disciplines or anything where it's about trying to work out human beings, kind of why I went into psychology too, although I didn't go down the sort of clinical or therapist route. Can I ask, what kind of therapy or kind of therapist are you?
I would be classified as an integrative therapist. So I bring together different modules, and then use different aspects in therapeutic work. I trained on the Petruska-Clarkson 5 relational model. So that incorporates working alliance, transference, person to person, the relationship, I can't remember that bit, and then transpersonal.
Is there any, I mean, that's quite interesting in and of itself. So I'm assuming, because I don't know an awful lot, I remember my modules on the different basic or key forms of therapy, but I know there'll be lots of things. So is the idea that you take the bits that you find really good or useful, is that the idea from different modes of therapy?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you get a kind of like this broad range of learning. So the main aspect was reading the book by Petruska-Clarkson, but then things like CBT was brought in. So we did a half day on CBT. We did a half day on transactional analysis, and looking at that aspect, because I think most things all feed into therapy anyway. Psychodynamic was quite a big part of it.
So some of this might come up as well, like the things that you find useful with your own. Do you class them as clients? I'm never sure about the terminology. Do you class them as clients?
I always say clients. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have colleagues that say patients, and I don't favour that term. I feel it creates an imbalance. I mean, there's an imbalance of power anyway, naturally. I feel it exacerbates that.
And I think, me personally, I think the use of the word patients makes sense when, for instance, it's a psychiatric ward and that individual doesn't actually have the freedom to leave the ward, for instance. Then I think patients is appropriate, because it does really highlight the power imbalance. But you, obviously, I'm assuming you have clients who come to you because they want to come to you and want to have some therapy. So that
absolutely
makes sense.
Yeah. They come autonomously.
Yes. Is it fair to say, what is the split in terms of the types of clients? So do you predominantly support and work with autistic or otherwise neurodivergent people, or is it a bit of a mix, or predominantly not?
Yeah, predominantly neurodivergent people. And I didn't set out that way. It just happened. I think you attract who you are with clients in therapy.
Fantastic. Okay, so that kind of gives us a good overview then, I think, of what potentially you do. But obviously, in terms of what we want to discuss, we've got our, you know me, everyone, I like a bit of structure. So we've just got some sort of prompts, and then I've got 4 questions from different people that I'd asked earlier today. And got some responses from people. So the first one as a prompt that I've got here is if we can have a discussion about autistic people and trauma. So I don't know what you'd like, or how you'd like to start with that discussion.
Well, I mean, as having watched Aucademy lives before, we know that autistic people are far higher to have experienced trauma than non-autistic people, just by being autistic and living in a predominantly neurotypical world. I don't think that's always acknowledged in the therapy space. There can be incidences where you can be neurotypical and have experienced trauma, or you can be autistic and are sometimes perhaps directed to be less autistic. So if you didn't do it that way, you wouldn't be experiencing that, and then you get harm in therapy. So that's how it kind of links in.
Can you describe that again for me, just so I can pick out the key things you just said? So
a lot of therapists wouldn't even think about looking for neurodivergence or autism when dealing with trauma. It was actually, if I'm honest, that was the main reason why I sought the diagnosis, because I was in therapy myself, and my therapist kept going back to the trauma, and I was telling her that it was something later. It wasn't to do with something that had happened in my earlier life. It was this, and we were having this backwards and forwards. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I know myself, I know how I feel. So therefore, I need to work out, is it autism, is it trauma, is it both? So by having the diagnosis, it gave me the ability to pull that apart.
And obviously, I can't expect you to answer this question fully now anyway, but is there a way to really start to pull that apart, the difference between being autistic, experiencing trauma, and how the two intersect? Because Roberta's point is quite key, which is, I think you're really lucky if you are autistic and haven't experienced trauma. I think it's sadly because of that the case that by dint of being autistic in an environment that is not suitable for us, we are more likely to experience trauma. And I think the question I'd like to ask, I guess, is, particularly with your own therapy training, is autistic trauma ever even recognised? Because in the sense of people have an understanding, or a lay person's understanding of what trauma or traumas could be. Does that make sense? So they would go to, I'm not going to go into details, but obviously everyone here, be conscious. We've got trigger warnings that we are discussing traumas and trauma, but we're not going to go into details. So just as a trigger warning there. So usually people will assume that trauma means things like childhood neglect, maybe assault of some description, those kinds of things. People understand those as trauma, if that's fair to say. So my question, if there is one, is, can it be recognised that there's autistic trauma that doesn't look like the typical understanding of trauma? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think, yes, it can be. I don't think we're there yet. I think, there are some therapists that do get it, that do understand it. However, we're also looking, I suppose, at recognising things like internalized ableism. So where the client themselves might be dismissive of the fact that they've been traumatized because they've lived in an environment for such a long time that has dictated that they behave in a certain way, that it's going to take a lot of unpicking and unpacking to help them even recognize that it could be trauma.
Yeah, that actually those experiences, whatever they might be, although other people wouldn't consider or even go to, well, that must be traumatizing. When you're autistic, they can be. So trying to give a concrete example, because I do like to try and give people things that are tangible. So we are going to have on Emma Reardon, for instance, who's going to talk about her work looking at autistic sensory trauma, and how that kind of stays in the body and things like this. And I've had this discussion with Kieran, actually, who made it sort of more apparent to me that I had experienced or have experienced sensory trauma. So we had I'm just going to give you this anecdotal sort of scenario that I experienced. I've discussed it on here before, like I say, with Kieran, but it was, I was at a dinner for a colleague who just finished their PhD, and it was a big table, and I was happy, I was with somebody that I knew who I'd asked ahead of time, because they knew I was autistic, can I please sit opposite you? And I knew that they'd be okay with the only thing I want to talk about is probably autistic things, or giant African land snails. And then somebody who I actually didn't know very well and wasn't sitting next to me, sitting opposite me, 2 sort of seats away, reached out and touched everyone in touching distance on the arms and things, and touched me directly on the skin. And I kind of pulled back and I was like, why are you touching me? Because I wasn't part of that discussion. And there's like, oh, don't worry, I'm doing it to everyone to make a point. And I'm like, that's not, no, that's not what I meant, and that's not what I asked, and I'm tactile averse, kind of thing. And then Kieran was like, because that was a few years ago, and Kieran was like, can you feel that now on your arm if you think about it? I'm like, yes, I can. It's very vivid. And he was like, that's trauma. That's like, does that make sense to you? Like,
yeah, completely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like smells, particularly, they're the ones that would affect me the most. But both from a wonderful sensory perspective, but also a traumatic sensory perspective of actually being able to put yourself immediately back into that place of where whatever it was happened was, because the memories don't fade with that.
It's so frustrating, because even describing it and thinking it, I can see it now, like the environment I was, because I'm very visual, so I can see it now, and the reaching out and all that kind of thing. And I describe it as, she touched me on the skin. Like, that's it's a really visceral thing. I mean, where else can we go with this discussion then on autistic people and trauma? So that's us trying to pick apart that trauma can look different for us. And we already know and mentioned that we're more likely to experience trauma. Are there any other things that you were hoping to talk about?
I suppose, partly is the internalized ableism, because that in itself is traumatic. Of how do you unpick that? Because the idea in therapy is that you don't lead your client, is that you go by your client's lead. However, when you can see perhaps that there's the possibility that this might be happening and it's going to be unhelpful to carry on that way, it's the tentative way in which you go about unpicking it, so that you're still affirmative with your client and what they need, but that you can, not challenge is the wrong word, but yeah, just unpack it.
I mean, can you give an example of how that might look or what you might do? Because we had that brief discussion before we popped on the live, which is that a lot of autistic people find Rogerian counselling methods really frustrating. So Rogerian methods are where the therapist or the counsellor will just basically repeat back to you what you just said.
They'll just paraphrase it, won't they? Yeah.
And paraphrase it. And for me personally, so I'm talking from a personal perspective, I find that very frustrating, because I'm like, I know that, I just said it. What I need is the insight, the thing that I'm not able to see or articulate or something like that. That's for me what I'm looking for, I think, when I have, I've had counselling, I've had therapy over the years, and that's what I'm actually looking for. I'm looking for the person to say, but have you considered this? Or, it might be that, or I see this actually.
Yeah. I mean, there are some sort of Rogerian aspects that might work rather than just the paraphrasing. So, for example, you might say something. I can't. All my examples have gone out of my head now, completely. So you might say, I'm really struggling in my relationship with my partner, and they might say, oh yes, I hear that's a real struggle for you at the moment, and I'd be like, well, yeah, I just said that. Whereas then the possibility of perhaps wording it in the, I wonder if what you're trying to tell me is, and then, sort of abridging that with more content. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense?
Yeah. Trying to elaborate on that, because I'm not a therapist, so I'm not, I'm not a clinical doctor. I'm a waffly philosophy doctor, but I do support autistic people in a non-therapeutic capacity, and to some extent, that kind of it can be quite useful, because a lot of the time, people I'm talking to or supporting, sometimes we can be quite good. Like, I'll say to my partner, I don't actually want you to give me solutions. I just want you to listen, a lot of the time. But a lot of the people that I might support or talk to, they actually don't want me to just listen. Again, it's some of that reflecting back to them what I can see that maybe they can't. So this is my long-winded way of saying, I understand what you mean by saying that sometimes you need to help that person unpick that internalized ableism, and not necessarily just, but obviously gently, not just let them lead completely, because otherwise that's just continued self-trauma, really, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the ways that a therapist could do that is they might say something like, how would you feel about me saying what I'm noticing? Or do you want my opinion on that? So that you give the client the opportunity to say yes or no.
So it's still them led.
Yeah.
But you're giving them options, and you're giving them that autonomy in that situation, but also offering, that's good. I like that. I mean, obviously we can do this generally. Do you have any examples of that sort of ableism where you would want to try and help them unpack it? I'm thinking of one person that I support who quite alexithymic, doesn't think in pictures, and has poor interoception. So for them, it's really not helpful to, either just, I say just parrot back at them. I know there's obviously more to it than that. But what actually is quite useful for them is for me to say, like say, what I can see. And because I've heard some, not just, from multiple people, I've had autistic people who are struggling with that internalized ableism will say things like, I hate the autism, or I hate being autistic, and things like that. So it's really quite difficult then because you, like I say, because I'm not a therapist, so I'm not there in that capacity, but it's very difficult because you're kind of like, but it's not autism's fault. Autism didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So do you have any examples that you generalize maybe?
Can you rewind? Because I had something and then
I might be able to. Yeah, do you have any, I guess, general examples of internalized ableism that you would want or hope to unpick or unpack with somebody?
So some of them would be it has nothing to do with my autism, what I've experienced, or another one might be something like, if somebody says, yes, but it is all my fault. Look at what I've done over the years, that type of thing. So really gently then exploring, sort of responsibility, age, developmental ability, those types of things. So kind of a little bit of like reparative work.
That must be quite hard, because both of those narratives are not, obviously there's no balance in those narratives. So whether it's a narrative where they're saying it's nothing to do with me being autistic, or my autism in quotation marks, she says in quotation marks, that's not a balanced view. And then wholly blaming themselves as an autistic person is also not a fair or balanced view.
So I might say something in that situation of, I'm noticing that what you're saying is it's either one thing or another. Let's look at some middle ground. Or how would you feel about looking at some middle ground? So that type of thing. But ensuring that the client has the lead, so that it doesn't create any more imbalance in the relationship. Another one of the big things is the kind of secrets of therapy that therapists don't tell their clients, that can be really unnerving for autistic clients. So things like those long silences, that kind of, am I supposed to say something? Are they supposed to say something? What happens next? Because that can be quite traumatic. That can be how a client could be harmed.
That's actually a really important point that you've brought up, and really interesting and key, because there's been a couple of reports, autistic-led or neurodivergent-led reports on what might actually benefit autistic people. So I had therapies of a number of different types before and after doing my psychology degree, actually, and during my psychology degrees, because that went on for like 10 years. So before and after my psychology degree, and also before and after knowing I was autistic.
Okay.
And what I found really actually very useful was, because when you do a basic psychology undergrad, you will learn, like say, some of the basics of different modes of therapy, right? So that's why I have a very basic understanding. I know it's more nuanced. Somebody made a point that Rogerian methods can be more than what I was describing, and I'm aware of that. I've forgotten it, although it was a few years back. But actually learning even just the basics and then going into therapy as an autistic person, I had some balance of power with the therapist to actually recognize why they were doing what they were doing, and I could work with it. It gave me some structure that I could understand and go, right, I know why they're doing that thing. Okay, so this is what they're needing from me in this situation, and that's how I will make the best out of this therapy. So I do find it odd that typically therapists, so maybe non-autistic or neurotypical therapists, although how many therapists are neurotypical? Other discussion.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I do find that very sort of a weird thing, that holding all this power and knowledge of therapy and how it works and things, because actually for us, it might actually make therapy work better for us if we know.
Oh, absolutely. And you've reminded me of many years ago when I had therapy. The therapist was talking about the drama triangle. And I remember saying to her, what are you talking about? And she said, well, what's happening in your relationship is reflective of the drama triangle. I said, so what is the drama triangle? And she sat and explained it to me. It was kind of not pre-internet, but before we used the internet as widely as we did now. And the following week, she brought me a printout of this drama triangle. Wow, it was mind-blowing, because I was able to read it in black and white, look at the three angles of the drama. For those that are listening, the drama triangle is a psychological toolkit, really, that describes how we interact with other people using the rescuer, the persecutor, and the victim. And it describes how we interact with our relationships by becoming either the victim, or we might then become the persecutor. We might then go into rescue mode. So an example of that might be you're talking to somebody and you're saying about your partner and how they didn't put the bins out that week. And you're really cross that they didn't put the bins out. And so you're kind of being the persecutor. Your friend then might say, but they never put the bins out. So they're kind of joining you, both being the persecutor. That might then trigger something in you. And you go, oh, no, they're not that bad. Actually, no, it was just this week. So then you become the rescuer, but the persecutor to them. It's a real play on.
You're actually, yeah. That's like really spot on, because two things in the last couple of years have been really, really, I mean, there's loads of things that have been really helpful in terms of my own well-being and things, but the two key things I would say is actually an autistic therapist friend explaining the drama triangle and how I keep getting sucked in, which is also something I need to recognize. Obviously, I keep getting sucked into playing the rescuer and then end up being the victim once I get sucked into people who they themselves are in, their own trauma and which they haven't dealt with. And I kept doing those with different people. And that was really helpful that she explained that to me. And I was like, yes, I've been doing that for years and I need to break that cycle. Yeah. The other thing that I learned, that's the most important thing I've learned from her, was the importance of boundaries. Just boundaries, which kind of goes hand in hand, actually. Hello, Kat. We don't need you today. Thank you. So yeah, boundaries. That was one of the biggest things for me. And that, I guess, goes hand in hand with the drama triangle stuff, is that learning to better articulate my boundaries and my needs and respect my own boundaries and my needs has been huge. I thought I was quite good with boundaries, but no, I'm not. And I need to be better. So those two things were really key.
They're really difficult to be good at as well at times, particularly when nobody has respected your boundaries ever before.
Particularly as autistic people.
Yeah.
Yes. Autonomy and respecting and all sorts of things of our bodily autonomy, our experiences of the world, and things. That actually leads us on to invalidation trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
Quite nicely.
And feeds into it things like consent. Because as children, you don't get the option with things like consent, because you're told to go and kiss granny. You're told to go and sit on somebody's lap, all those types of things. So we don't learn boundaries, because what is a boundary?
Yeah.
Your body doesn't actually belong to you. And particularly for an autistic person, then the potential for that is far more reaching because of the sensory trauma that's potentially attached.
And obviously not going into, we're not going to go into detail in anything today, but then that leads us on to things like ABA, behavioural approaches and things, which again is removing an autistic person's autonomy in bodily autonomy and decision making and communication and all sorts of things. There's lots of difficulties there with the invalidation trauma. Yeah, and yeah, it's very interesting learning boundaries. And I don't know about you, I spoke about this the other day, which is the kind of, to some extent, the beauty within the autistic community. Not always. Lots of us, obviously, fairness, some autistic people aren't great, some autistic people are lovely, some autistic people are bog standard, we're all allowed to be varied. But what, generally speaking, I think quite lovely is the respect of boundaries, we recognize so much of other autistic people that we are very likely to have experienced trauma. So we're always quite, or tend to be, again, I don't want to generalize too much, but be more respectful of that. So Tanya Adkins mentioned, we don't take each other's spoons, so energy without consent. So we'll say, if you don't have the spoons for this, you don't need to reply. We take a bit more respect with people's boundaries a lot of the time. Not always. We can be, like I say, I'm still trying to learn my boundaries and stick to them.
No, yeah, me too. And I think it's going to be an ever evolving practice for me, because I might learn it, but then something might happen and I'll go back a bit. I'm definitely probably a people pleaser. Yeah, definitely. But also with boundaries, as the therapist, I'd need an element of flexibility, which sometimes for some therapists you don't get that. A boundary is a boundary. If you're late, you lose so much of your session. If you don't turn up, you're going to be charged. If the bus is leaving, sort of 10 minutes towards the end of your session, so you might either need to start early, those types of things. So speaking to the therapist and explaining why you need the flexibility is a good step. However, that can take a real lot of courage. So for the therapist to be aware and say, do you have any other requirements?
Yeah, that self-advocacy, that is something, again, I'm really interested in at the moment, which is how helping autistic people build their own personal self-advocacy, recognizing their needs and how to articulate those needs, because we don't all know what our needs are and then how to self-advocate for them. That's interesting as well that you say about those therapists, that they sound like they have incredibly rigid boundaries.
Well, that's what we're taught in training school.
Rigid boundaries, yeah. And I remember the discussion, like I say, I had with this autistic therapist friend, and the reason I don't name her is because she gets a lot of work and then she'd get inundated. So I try to prevent her getting overwhelmed. And yeah, having that discussion about what are your real rigid boundaries that nobody is allowed to, try and dent. Do you have some flexible boundaries? So like you said, even if it's just flexible things as a therapist around time for people to turn up, because which is always bizarre, particularly if they know that person is neurodivergent, because some of our autistic students would get heavily penalised and potentially lose support because they couldn't make it to their mentor appointment. But it was an autistic specialist mentor. And you would think that they would recognise this person might not always turn up on time and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That doesn't make any sense at all, because that in itself is going to, it would certainly create a trauma for me, because I would become so paranoid about being late that I wouldn't be able to access any therapy in therapy.
Yes. Yep. Because you're too worried about, oh no, I was late, and
what they're thinking. Yeah.
And Anushka, Anushka, I've actually got one of your questions, is one of the questions I want to bring up that you posted earlier on today. And I think this question of how do people advocate to get to be listened to and understood, I mean, you're welcome to have a stab at this question, but what I'm wondering is, it would be good to cover this as a broader, longer session, literally on self-advocacy. How do we do that? How can we start to do that? And how can we start to build that? So I don't know if you've got a brief response to this now, and then we can think about a bigger session at some point on actual self-advocacy skills.
Yeah, it's much wider, isn't it? Because it's going to be different for different people. It's going to take different resources from different people of how they do that. Because a simple answer is to say what you need and know what you need, but we know that it's not that simple to do that. I've had the same therapist for years, and it's probably only in the last, and I'm a therapist, it's only in the last 6 months that I've really been able to sort of say, actually, I don't agree with you. So the time and confidence that it takes we've got to have a good therapist to start with, I think.
And that's a whole other discussion. Yeah. As well. So I'm conscious of the time, because we've actually covered quite a bit already, but we've only got onto like the second comment that I have in my structure. This happens all the time. So I guess, right, so we've talked about autistic people and trauma. We've touched on invalidation trauma. I don't know if you wanted to, was there anything specific about invalidation trauma you were thinking of? I felt like you were discussing or thinking more along the lines of the therapist invalidating the individual than general autistic invalidation trauma. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, within that client therapist relationship. So that for one of the things that I always do, and it probably sounds really small, but what I've noticed with, like, for example, my therapist, not the current one, this is a previous one, was when we were meeting and they'd email me about it, they would always put their name first and my name second. So it would be ex-therapist meeting with Angela. For me, that creates some invalidation, like they're more important than me.
That's really interesting, because now that I'm thinking about it, whenever I send notes and things to my consultees, I always put I put their initials, because I anonymize a lot of things, but because I give them video, the recordings for the session, and then I delete it my end so they've got it to process. But even in that, I put their initials with Chloe.
Yeah.
I know I just did that naturally. I don't know why, because it was their session.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't mine.
Yeah, so it makes complete sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To do it that way. So I'm interested in the psychology around why somebody would do it the other way around. What is what's going on for them?
That's really interesting. I hadn't ever thought of that, or why I do that, but I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's their session, so they go first.
Yeah.
And I just say with Chloe. I don't say with Dr. Farahar. I just say it's with Chloe.
Yeah.
As well. Interesting. Okay. So in terms of that then, so the invalidation trauma, and then how that might impact well-being and seeking therapy. That's our next note.
Okay.
So how might that impact well-being and seeking therapy?
So it could stop people forever. You've had a poor experience, a traumatic experience. Why would you want to go there again?
Yeah.
So it could put a real significant barrier up for the autistic person. So undoing that, what I would say I don't want to use the word good therapist, but I suppose that's what I mean, would offer somebody time, a free 20 minutes, a free half an hour. They wouldn't want them to make any decisions within that meeting. They'd enable them to feel empowered, so that they're the ones that go away and think about, is this the right fit for me? Is this person going to provide what I need? Can I trust them? Are they safe?
And I think I'm gonna put Estin's apologies if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly. I'm going to put their comment on as well. So this isn't necessarily to address this per se, but it's relevant. So they said that 2 of their recent therapists triggered them a lot during therapy because they assumed non-autistic kinds of things might work for them, and then they had to be the one to educate their therapist, navigate their fragility, etc., around not having the knowledge about being or autistic experience, I'm assuming. So Estin currently really hesitant in continuing or starting a new therapy. So like you said, so that invalidation, them not having that knowledge, and then having to navigate their fragility, which I find that's an interesting way of framing it actually, Estin. I think that's, I don't know if you can speak to that, that navigating their fragility. So they're hesitant to start a new therapy. So like you just said, it now impacts whether they're going to actually get support or attempt to get support, although they have a lot of trauma and struggle with trauma responses. And then their next, is there anything there you wanted to address? Because there actually is another section.
Well, firstly, I'm really sorry you've had that experience. It's really feel for you, because it isn't up to the client to educate the therapist. Not saying that the client isn't going to educate the therapist, because we're learning all the time. We don't know everything. However, what I would hope for would be somebody that would be able to, even if they don't know anything about being autistic, is they say, tell me what your experience has been. So you don't have to know about autism per se.
A bit of humility. So not that fragility of not knowing something, that having to navigate the therapist's fragility, them actually being humble and saying, you're right, I don't know enough about that. And working, like you say, that power imbalance. So actually working on that equitable footing. You teach me about the autistic things. Let's see what of my knowledge and skills I can bring to actually help with what you're struggling with.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, go away and educate yourself about, some things around it, but never take that away from the client's experience, because that will always have more depth than what you can read from a textbook, what you can read from Google.
And sadly, this is the next comment that Estin makes. So they give an example that one therapist, they think, panicked because what they were doing caused Estin to disassociate, and it was because they were expecting me to respond in different ways. They then tried to ground me by asking for eye contact, obviously very problematic, by asking me to say mouth words, but they struggled a lot making mouth words, and even offered physical touch.
It sounds
and I've
like
actually had, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it doesn't sound like the therapist was trying to ground Estin. It sounds like the therapist was trying to ground themselves.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And I've had really well-meaning, lovely disability advisors who've actually worked for a long time with autistic students, and they were really lovely. That I actually considered them a colleague and a friend. And sometimes they lose, they forget, which is different to actually that laundry list of very traumatizing expectations. But that disability advisor offered me, when I was actually struggling and having a little bit of a cry in their office, they offered to try and hug me, and I, even in the middle of that, I said thank you, but please don't. And they felt terrible, but then we moved on quickly. It wasn't about their embarrassment that they made that mistake and things. It was, okay, actually I made that mistake, let's move away from that. I feel like this person's ego potentially was damaged by making mistakes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And people are going to dissociate in therapy. It's going to happen, because when you're seeing people that have experienced trauma, their brain is going to do what it needs to do to keep them safe. And dissociation is a form of keeping yourself safe.
Yeah. And our SI, so our Northern Autie, even made a comment and a note to say that, when individuals are hyperfans, like myself, very, very vivid imagery and tactile sensation, like memory and things as well, then we might get triggered in particular ways because of that. You know, somebody's trying, and so actually we do need some forms of disassociation from that while we try to work through whatever it is we're trying to work.
Dissociation isn't unhealthy. It might not always be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah.
But it's not unhealthy.
Thank you. Yeah, we had fantastic Autistic Selves and James North I think it was last Saturday. I've lost all sense of time, describing different forms of disassociation, including what James described as everyday autistic disassociation, as well as experiences of being a system, i.e. having alters and things as well. So thank you. That's actually quite nicely affirming of people who do experience disassociation.
Yeah.
I've got a couple other comments to come back to, but I quite like to try and look at the questions that we had because I'm conscious of the time as well. So we were asked, are there any online resources? Actually, while I say this, was there anything that you wanted to touch on before we moved on to the questions?
I don't think so. I quite like the topic of dissociation and how it works. And if people want this, I mean, the woman that has the website, she's neurotypical, I think. However, I don't know for sure. But Carolyn Spring writes a lot about dissociation and has some brilliant visual resources.
And who was that? Sorry, so we can find a link for them.
Carolyn Spring.
Carolyn, is it with an E?
It's with a Y.
Carolyn Spring. Okay.
Yeah.
Si, if you wouldn't mind. So Carolyn Spring, and what was so?
I think it's www.carolynspring.co.uk.
Okay.
She writes a lot about trauma, so that be aware of the trigger warning.
Be conscious of that.
With that, but the resources that she set. So she does these little cards. They're really, I find them really good. So they're just little, like wallet cards. This one says feelings are meant to be felt. They're not supposed to be denied, believed, or acted upon. They're just feelings. Feelings are meant to be felt, and they're self-grounding cards, I guess. Is the so they have things about when people get triggered, and as an autistic person, I found them quite helpful. So.
Fantastic. Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind, if you can find a link to pop in the comment section, that would be appreciated. But if you do it later, that's not a problem. Very briefly, just because Si's popped it up. So could animal, nature, art or physical-based therapy be more effective for neurodivergent people?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's well documented. I think that equestrian therapy can be really helpful. That attunement with a non-judgmental being. Art therapy, absolutely.
I think what I
depends
find
on the individual.
Yes, and that's right, because I've had this conversation with Sam Harris of Neurodive, who's lovely, and he asked me the question that I always find kind of amusing and also frustrating, but he's lovely, so it was okay. But, you know, what therapy works for autistic people? And I was like, it depends on so many factors.
Yeah.
So I think it's, finding what works for you, and potentially that actually might help us with one of the questions. So I'm going to come back to James's question because I think that's really important. But I'm just thinking, because this naturally leads on to Ben's question, which was any advice on accessing therapy for non-verbal or situationally mute autistic people. So actually, I think what you just said is having that interaction that might not necessarily, like with an animal, for instance, in like an equine therapy. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That actually is quite a good suggestion, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Any type of animal therapy. We've got a place near where I live, and they do equine. They have small animals, goats, all sorts. And it's the bodily attunement that often can help the most, rather than the spoken word.
Yes, and I think that is really key. Like we say, particularly if it is an individual who either never or is unable, or for whatever reason, to use mouth words, or it's just not as reliable that they can use mouth words all the time. And like some people's comments have said, you know, some people have commented that in therapy sessions they would go non-orally verbal because of the situation in the therapy setting and so on. So yeah, having other modes and skills and tools for those instances, and for people who really don't ever or cannot ever use mouth words, and not relying on the spoken word. Do you have any other thoughts on that, actually? So advice for therapy so obviously we just discussed that you could look into other modes that aren't talking therapies, because talking therapies is broad. There's a lot of different talking therapies, but it's not the only therapy. So yeah, non-talking based or limited talking based therapies. So any other advice on accessing therapy for situationally mute autistic people?
So looking at therapists that do text therapy, it is possible to do therapy by text. If somebody, you know, can type, there's even on, like, if you're doing it over Zoom, using the chat rather than expecting somebody to use a spoken word. I know myself that my front brain shuts down sometimes, so all the words are there, but I can't get them out of here.
Yes.
So just being able to type them can be enormously helpful.
Is that happening more often, would you say, now, particularly with the lockdown? So is there more opportunity for people to be able to do Zoom-based therapy, and then obviously they would have the option to ask, can I use the chat box?
Yeah, and it should be offered by the therapist as well. How would you prefer to communicate?
Oh yes, Malia, I actually heard that first as well. Initially, I heard tech therapy and got excited for working on robots while in therapy, which that was interesting.
Oh, there is Minecraft therapy.
Minecraft therapy.
Yeah.
That's a thing. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, there is. There's therapists that work purely online, gaming.
Where are they? That would be very useful. Is this just like one individual, or is this like a?
No, there's a group of people. I know the name of one person. I know that she's already fully booked, and I'm a bit reluctant to give her name out because she might get then overwhelmed. But I can probably find you a link.
Yes, but is it worth? Yes, so is it worth these? Are learners searching for? Is it specifically Minecraft, or is it gaming based? I'm quite conscious that we typed in gaming therapy, it might be that people are trying to reduce people's gaming, and actually that's not what we're talking about at all. Is there? Yeah, Ben is saying I need the deets, because I know Ben is much more likely to use like Discord or something in relation to gaming. So that sounds really, really useful and important. Sai's just kind of joking, but gaming and eating therapy, please. So what should we suggest people look for? Minecraft therapy?
Yeah, you could Google Minecraft therapy or video games therapy, because there are people out there that work solely that way.
That sounds very, very helpful.
I do have links for them. I just can't think of them off the top of my head.
No, that's fine. We'll pin them. We'll pop them in. That would be fantastic. Diana says gaming-based counselling and learning up to age 21. I mean, it's nice it exists. It would be nice if it didn't have an age limit, though. Obviously, given a lot of autistic people will be older than 21 and would actually benefit from that. So, but at least that's a start. So maybe they can look into it and see if there's other people, or if they're willing to actually take on anyone over the age of 21. That's really helpful. I'm really pleased about our response now, for your response to that particular question. So So let's go back to James's. So are there any online resources or groups focusing on identifying or living with autistic trauma, or info how to self-direct for therapies, especially if you're stuck with neurotypical informed therapies, which are usually too triggering to be useful? Now I'm going to pop that in the comments box because it might be useful to actually see that to answer it, or attempt to answer it. I'll pop it on the screen for you. Any thoughts?
So there is an organisation that's quite new at the moment. I'm part of the steering group, and it's the Association of Neurodivergent Therapists. All of the therapists that will be under their listing, their directory, will have some sort of neurodivergence. I always myself, yeah. So there is that directory that you could take a look at. It's a bit small at the moment because it's a very new. Yeah, it's a very new.
Can anybody access that?
Yeah.
So yeah, I do know that one. What was it again? Remind me.
It's neurodivergenttherapist.com.
Therapists.
Yes.
Therapists.
They are. I don't know so much about
neurodivergent therapists. Is it that one? Did you say?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's called the Association of Neurodivergent Therapists, but the website is neurodivergenttherapist.com.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. So let's pop that in there as well. So, James, it's a start. So hopefully that's a start for you to have a look into. And I guess they were also saying groups focusing on identifying living with autistic trauma or self-directed therapies. Triggering or useful. Yeah. I don't know if they, so obviously we've just linked, oh, you're welcome, James. So obviously we've just linked the association with, so they're building a list of neurodivergent therapists. Fantastic. Yeah. I don't know if James is also thinking of groups in terms of autistic people who've experienced trauma that are supporting one another. So I'm not sure, James, if you want to just clarify for us. Do you know of any groups like that, or?
There's a Facebook group called Neurodivergent Relationships, and I know trauma comes up in that. Did I say Facebook? Yeah, that's on Facebook.
Okay. I think actually there's lots of key things that we're able to give people today. I'm very pleased. It's always nice to be able to actually give people some tools and resources and things to actually go away with. Fantastic.
What will happen, Chloe, after this is all of those groups and things will come back to me because my brain will suddenly open up again. So if I can email you links and things afterwards, is that okay?
Yeah, because I can list it on our main page. So obviously, dependent on where people are coming from, because I have potentially some people might be on YouTube, but anything I post will likely go to the main Facebook page and our Twitter page. Just in case anyone wants to come back and check if we've got any extra links and things. Somebody's just said the Association for Neurodivergent Therapists is for therapists only, isn't it? And then question marks, so they're not too sure. It does look like that you can access. So it does say, so the website, so maybe the Facebook page, for instance, might be just for the therapists themselves, but having a look, Estin, on this website that we've just linked in the comment section, it does have a button, find a neurodivergent therapist. So it does look like it's accessible to people who might be potential clients.
Yeah.
So I think hopefully that answers that question. I'm just wondering, where is it? I'm going to grab. So James has clarified. So safe spaces for traumatized adults would be good, so we can kind of validate our own traumas, I figured. Yeah, so if you think of any, we can always list them. So don't worry about it too much if you can't think of any right now.
Okay. No, I saw one come up earlier, so I will go back and see where that was.
Fantastic. We'll do that afterwards. Thank you. So a couple more questions, if that's okay. So Amy asks or says, and actually I'll post it again because I got these earlier on today. Oh, so I have made a comment, which is something I was actually thinking as well with that question from James about groups. So Sai says, I used to be in a complex PTSD group, and it was so toxic. So I was concerned about that potential, that if those individuals are kind of relying on other people to sort of talk about their trauma, that actually might be quite a triggering space for a lot of people and not really give you any therapeutic benefit. So I know it's not ideal because there's not enough neurodivergent therapists or neurodivergent understanding therapists. But sometimes, I would be a little bit concerned about groups like that in case there is that toxicity. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I would completely agree with you. I really struggle myself. I don't tend to comment a lot on Facebook and things purely because of, I'm sure I must have that, is it rejection sensitive dysphoria type thing?
Yeah, lots of rejection sensitivity throughout the community.
Yeah. I've actually posted in a group that was for therapists with can you help me understand this? I don't understand. And the response really put me off that I left the group. So, yeah, I think you've just got to be very, very choosy and sort of, if you join something, allow yourself to read through before deciding whether you're going to stick with it.
Yeah, does it look like a space that you're actually going to benefit from and derive peer support, or does it look like a relatively toxic space? I think you could probably work that out, like you say, skimming through and seeing what people talk about and things. I think that's a good baseline to get an understanding.
Absolutely.
Of as well.
I would always suggest being, if you're looking at those types of groups, is be a member of it for a good couple of weeks, because that should give you a broad spectrum of some of the interactions that happen within it. And is it supportive or is it attacking?
So be conscious of your own boundaries and your well-being, even though we're, like we say, we need to build those. Thank you. Just very briefly, this comment, so possible outside the scope of this discussion, but have we covered cost? We haven't. Yes, so imagine a lot of autistic people would struggle to pay for therapy, and I think what the NHS offers is rather limited. Any thoughts on that?
Most therapists that I know have a sliding scale of costs. They might reserve one or two places for very low cost. So not that they means test people. I would take somebody at face value. If they tell me they can't afford it, I'm going to believe them. So, and I know a lot of my colleagues also do that. So it's always worth asking. In actual fact, it's probably worth having a thing up on after this about good questions to ask potential therapists as well.
That would be lovely. Do you want to make a note, or shall I make a note? Because I know you're going to send me some links, hopefully, anyway, for people. So I think this has all been very, very useful for people. So just a note about just key questions.
Yeah, I've just made it. Yeah, like a list of 10 key questions, because you should be able to ask your therapist anything you want. And if you've got a good therapist that isn't defensive, they will answer you.
Yeah.
If you want to see their credentials, if you want to know their qualifications, if you want to know who they're registered with, if they offer, even if you ask them, do you offer free sessions? Things like that.
Free or low cost sessions, because I'm on a low income. And I'm the same actually with my like, again, very clear non-therapeutic consults is I just take it at face value. If somebody says I'm on a low income, absolutely fine. Let's have a chat about what we can manage. I had a thought and I've lost it. Where was it? Oh, okay. And I like this idea of having some key questions to ask therapists. I think arming autistic people, because a lot of us do need those scripts, and actually arming people with that would be really beneficial. Thank you. So if you do have a think, we could even make it a little shareable. I like infographics. So I could even do that. If you give them some key pointers that people can just share with each other, that would be great. Because I'm thinking, again, somebody that I supported at the university, we got to a point where I'd got them to a place where they felt like they were actually going to ask for trauma-based therapy, because I can only do so much as a non-therapist where I'm supporting someone and they need trauma therapy. So we sat and we put some bullet points on what they needed or how to explain what they wanted from the therapist. And it was just really disheartening and disappointing, because, you know, it took months to get them to agree to go and talk to somebody and ask for therapy in the first place. And then when they were describing, you know, so we'd worked through what their profile was so they could explain that to the therapist, because we recognise the therapist isn't necessarily going to understand. And it was key things like, she doesn't think in pictures. So that means lots of tools are out the window, can't do imagination techniques and so on. She's alexithymic, because that goes hand in hand when you don't think in pictures, and she struggles with interoception, and she wanted some support with this, this and this. So nice key things. First stumbling block. What's alexithymia? I've not heard of that. Really? Okay. Oh. What's aphantasia? I've not heard of that either. Now, okay, don't necessarily expect everyone to have heard necessarily of aphantasia, but alexithymia, I would assume.
Alexithymia as a therapist would be almost essential, wouldn't it?
I would have thought so. So my poor student just felt really frustrated, and it just got to a point where they said, well, you're autistic is an autism thing and I can't help you. And it's like, no, she'd been quite clear. This is my autistic. The main things you need to know about my profile, which we'd worked on, and spent lots of time working out what her profile was. But these are the traumas I've experienced that I would like therapy for.
Yeah.
So just that really dismissive thing. And then at the end, but if you want to come back and we have, I can do some imagination techniques with you. And she'd already explained, but I can't think in pictures, so I can't do that. You know, so it was really disheartening. Taking all that courage to get her, months to get her to agree to seek trauma therapy.
Yeah.
It was so disheartening.
And what really concerns me is, what did that person hear? Did they go away and go, oh, okay, I need to find another therapist? Or did they go away and go, well, I'm clearly just too complex?
Yeah, they did. They, as far as I know, this was quite a few weeks back. I'm pretty sure they haven't sought any further support outside of the other type of non-therapeutic support they already get. But they need therapy. They need good trauma-informed therapy.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come to, we've got two more of the key questions, but obviously let me know if you're starting to lose spoons. So we've got this one from Amy. So both Amy and their son have found, this is so difficult because I'm trying to do it in, I'll do it in first person as if I'm Amy. It's too hard to try and change it. So both I and my son have found stories to be the most healing of experiences, such as in the Jungian school of therapy. Do other autistic folk share this preference, and could it be linked to the enduring autistic need for meaning in all things? So when we had a quick discussion before coming on, we talked about this. I'd also, people feel free, you know, to answer that for yourself. Do other autistic people, do you share that preference for healing via stories? I think is quite interesting. So any thoughts on this question or comment?
Well, it's interesting because when we talked about it earlier, I wasn't so sure, was I? But as this session's gone on, I think probably it would be something that I would do myself. I would learn about different experiences in life. Oh, people do things like that. Oh, that's where that comes from. So it would give me affirmation, I think. And I can see why it would work for other autistic people for sure.
And certainly building those stories together in a safe space, I think would be. So I don't know the ins and the outs at all, but like there is is it a narrative therapy or a narrative, or is that like a tool used in certain or number of therapies, like a narrative based therapy?
How do you mean?
I'm sure I've seen that in some of the different spaces that I'm in, where they talk about narrative based therapy, where they work on the individual's personal story and narrative of their life, like how they've made meaning through their life.
So like almost like life storytelling.
Potentially, if that's a thing, you'll know more than I will about. Is that a thing? Life
So you can do life stories to take you through from birth to now. Some people do it as what's traditionally called a timeline, but actually having it as a story for me would have more meaning. Being able to explore the whole aspect of that person's life. What a privilege as well.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting is there's a couple of comments actually on this topic, which is so Estin saying, I personally don't like healing through stories so much. James says stories and analogies make it relatable, but distance, which can help, in their opinion, maybe personal preference rather than autistic preference. And Victoria says, I like that Victoria loves folk tales and fables. I think what's interesting is that because this question could be actually, or this comment could be different things. So is it working through and healing through fiction? So like, you know, loving of tales and fables and folk tales and things, or is it also, so if Amy's here, I don't know if you want to clarify at all. So are you meaning healing through stories that don't necessarily relate personally to you, or what I just described and what Angela just described, which is that storytelling of your own, so your personal life story? So if you are here, I mean, feel free to clarify this, but I'm conscious you might not be here. Yeah, so there's that could mean two different things, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like, one of the things that came up in training was about using stories. Is it by the Brothers Grimm?
Okay.
The Grimm fairy tales.
Yeah.
I've never used them, but it's on my list of, I really must look at that.
Yeah, sounds interesting.
Yes, yeah, because I vaguely remember Grimm fairy tales as a child, but remember them being quite graphic.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. Like, is that not going to be? I mean, for me, again, hyper fan, thinking very vividly in pictures. I don't know if I'd enjoy that because it might be too vivid and visceral and this kind of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure. Oh yes, let me know if you look into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been on my list for a long time, so there's a reason why I haven't sort of gone with it and used other methods and things. So I'm going to write it down. I'm going to buy a book and read it.
Fantastic. Anushka, I totally can't do stories or analogies with alexithymia. It has to be person focused, form many. Is that mainly? Did you mean maybe at the end of there, Anushka? So that, and again, Anushka, do you think in pictures? Because like I say, it's so, the link between not thinking in pictures, this will be the hill I die on, but you don't think, I bring it up every session, I swear. If you don't think in pictures, you're more likely to struggle with that alexithymia and interoception issues. There's no negative connotations on any of that. Nothing's better or worse than any other experience. But I can see why that would make fiction or fables really quite difficult, because they're not very tangible and concrete for many. Oh, thank you, Anushka. Yes. And then Anushka says that, yeah, aphantasic. Yeah, so I can see how that would be really difficult. So again, going back to the student that I always go back to this lovely student, the one that I mentioned, that it was really disappointing by the time they got to a therapist, they just got really dismissed. But absolutely, we don't work on any analogies whatsoever. I made the mistake of just saying, I can see why that situation was the straw that broke the camel's back. And she just looked at me really confused. And I went, no, right, aphantasia, I remember. And I had to think of a better way to express what I was trying to say. And so I definitely don't work on abstract things. We work on what happened to you this week when we're having a chat. We don't work on fluffy things that you can't grasp. Yeah. Fantastic. Right, we can take this one down. Very, very interesting. And then my last one, Anushka. So I'll copy it again and we'll pop it into the box. I think this has been really helpful. I was quite concerned because we've had quite a lot of quite serious and sensitive sessions. And I was thinking, oh, we're covering trauma again. Oh, no. But actually, I feel, hopefully people in the comment section too are feeling it, that there's been some really nice signposting for things and actually quite useful things in looking for therapies and stuff. So I'm quite pleased that it's not been depressing, which is good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's lovely. So Anushka asks, is there therapy for parents and carers? And I know that Anushka is autistic, so I'm assuming we also mean autistic parents and carers here. And so what they say is, I think that is the best way forward. Individual personalised training programs and support for the ones in responsibility. Change the environment, not the person. Absolutely fantastic. And get carers to be able to deliver the correct communication and environment is the first foundation to stability. Where do people find this help? Now, we're conscious we might not be able to answer all these questions, but there's a number of nice things in here that I recognise Anushka is saying or asking, which is that particularly if they're an autistic parent, they might need that support too.
Yeah,
because they have likely, like their autistic young people, had to experience autistic traumas of some description, invalidation trauma. So that makes sense. And about changing the environment and not the person. And I like this. Yes, so get carers to be able to deliver the correct communication and environments is the first foundation to stability. And this is nice because obviously, as we've been chatting, we've talked about basically different communication styles and different communication methods. Alexithymia, if you struggle to articulate emotion, then there's going to be reasons why you can't use non-autistic language of happiness and sadness. We've talked about people who might be situationally mute and things. So delivering the correct communication, I quite like this, Anushka. So any thoughts on this one? Where do people find this kind of help?
So I don't know of any that is particularly neurodivergent led, other than the organisation where I work with, Laura Kerbey. She's neurodivergent. She delivers a lot of training and does a lot of training courses. There is the books that I tend to read are the ones by Luke Bearden.
Yep.
He's just bought one out. I don't know if he's just bought it out, but I've only just bought it. That's what I mean. On how to avoid anxiety in autistic children.
That's a relatively new one. Yep.
Is it? Yeah. I only bought it this week, so I shall be getting my teeth into that. Not literally, obviously. So yeah, they're kind of my go-tos for signposting. There is Affinity Hub, which is set up for parent carers. I don't know if I can't think of her name now. The lady that set it up, I don't know whether she is neurodivergent or not. But there is an awful lot of resource and information on there. And it's probably something you could ask the question about, are any of these therapists that are on here neurodivergent? That perhaps might be one of the first questions to ask. Jo, is it? Jo is her name. I can't think of her surname.
I'm just going to pop the people onto the screen. So Luke Bearden's book, Avoiding Anxiety, I'm assuming that says in autistic children. Yeah, in autistic children. So that's quite a new book. And Luke Bearden, yes, is we credit Luke Bearden for the equation, if you like, which is autism plus the environment equals the outcome, which is what Anushka talked about there as well, which is it's about the environment. That's the thing that we want to be focusing on a lot of the time. So that's I've popped on the screen. So yeah, I probably would recommend actually a lot of things like that book would be quite useful. Anushka has actually clarified for us, which is that it's actually for more for non-autistic people, carers and professionals. So they're just clarifying for us. So what they're saying is, so what they're actually asking is not necessarily about therapy. They're saying about, yes, programs and things for non-autistic people who are responsible for autistic young people. So that makes complete sense, Anushka. I know what you're talking about there. So yeah, you're quite right. There's a number of programs. So you've mentioned one or two. We've got Jodie Izzett's.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
The Nurture program. Si, feel free if if you've got any of those links. So Jodie is, it's the Nurture program. Kieran Rose does fantastic, very low cost, in-depth programs as well for families, professionals. They're the two key ones I probably can think of that would be really good for non-autistic carers and professionals. If anyone can think of any that I've forgotten, pop them in the comment section. That would be really useful. So that was about the book. The other thing I can think of, particularly if we're thinking about young people, but actually it probably could work for adults too, which is all about knowing your normal, and that's in relation to anxiety. So let me just find that, because that might be useful for people.
There's the girl with the curly hair as well, isn't there? The Curly Hair Project. I know
Okay,
she's
do they have a course? Is that what you're thinking?
I think they do. Like, yeah, they have different presenters in different parts of the UK going around and doing like half-day courses and things.
Fantastic. So what I'm going to do for people is, I'm just finding, it's called a Know Your Normal Toolkit. I found a really snazzy little website thing today that can actually shorten really long URLs, which is very useful.
Yeah, I'm hopeless at things like that. Really, not my strong point. Anything technology-wise. Yeah, awful.
This is the maybe I should have made a link to explain what this was, because it's just a link. So it's the Know Your Normal Toolkit. I say it is designed for young people. And this is all about how autistic people, for instance, we're more likely to have a higher baseline of anxiety. And this toolkit is about how to learn what your baseline is. And then you can recognize when you actually need support, like when you're more likely to need therapy and so on, or something's just not right in your environment. So it's about helping you recognize your normal, which can be obviously quite difficult when we're autistic, right? And we've got alexithymia and a number of these things. So let me just do.
Another one is Special Needs Jungle, which is online. I can't not mention Special Needs Jungle.
There's also the Level Up program. I don't know if they do courses per se, but they
don't do courses, but it's quite good for just sort of generally having a look, especially for things for parent carers to look at for education resources.
Oh, and some people have, yes, Christy Forbes is In Tune Families. Yeah, so Christy Forbes. I say you've also got, just popping that up there, Know Your Normal Toolkit. Oh, yeah, anything Neurodive. Yes, so lots of fantastic suggestions. Oh, all the Minecraft therapy I'm finding online is for children. I still would message them. I would still ask and explain that you're an autistic person. Maybe.
I definitely would, because even if they don't do it, they might know somebody that does, because the circles are generally relatively small.
Yes, they might be able to signpost you. That's a very good point. Yeah, very, very good point. Anushka's going to give some of these to their daughter's school, and send them to Aucademy. A lot of the stuff we do is free. Fantastic.
I think Sienna Castle, is it Sienna Castleton? Did she write the spectrum?
Oh, young person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she does. I don't know if she does courses, but she started off the neurodiversity celebration week in schools.
In the weeks, yeah. I don't think she does courses per se. I know she does champion that stuff. Yeah. Okay, so I don't want to go. I've said this for a while, but I don't want us to go on too much longer. So I'm just having a quick think.
Yeah.
I think we've covered quite a lot actually, and I'm quite pleased with what people have been saying in the chat box as well. Has been really good.
That's good, because I always get really anxious about these sort of things as to, am I going to say the wrong thing?
No, and this is what I say. I mean, it's and we've got such lovely people in the comment section. We really do. Always lovely, lovely people. It's always lovely, I think, and kind, and yeah, everyone supports one another. It's fantastic. I'm having just like a little little love fest now of how lovely everybody is. I think because this is quite like I say, because of the time and everything, and I know that Estin would like some support. So I think we could probably have a quick look at this their comment and statement, but it might be that we need a longer chat, or whether you've got any suggestions of where Estin might seek some support or some answers for their question. So they're just saying, so what could help them? So they struggle with alexithymia and interoception, struggle with understanding big reactions, let alone navigating them in ways that don't impact others in unwanted ways. They could benefit from therapy that empowers them to recognise what's going on inside me without forcing me into non-autistic ways of naming them. What I mean is, yesterday in an Aucademy related talk, people said descriptors like sad, angry, happy, which didn't make much sense to them. And then it makes much more sense to learn. And then the problem is StreamYard cuts it off when it feels like it's a long statement. So let me just quickly find the rest of that comment. But feel free if there's anything there you wanted to address while I just look for the longer comment.
Okay. I think I probably would like a little bit of time to think about it.
Yes, there's quite a bit there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to what we did discuss in that session yesterday, Estin, was that yes, sometimes it is worth trying to find somebody to help support you to recognise and maybe start to be able to name those sorts of basic emotions in quotation marks. But actually, it might be worth spending more time with autistic people to work out, like we described yesterday in the session, how we articulate how we're feeling, which might be more physical. So like Tanya was talking about, you know, how many neurotypical people understand the feeling that your head is really foggy, or, you know, these kinds of things. Does that make sense? And I talked about my feeling of feeling small, right? So I don't really talk about sadness or angriness or happiness. I talk about feeling small, or, you know, things that make sense maybe amongst autistic people. But I don't want to dismiss that this person also might want to work on being able to describe those sorts of emotions that neurotypical people might understand.
One of the things that I do work with a lot is cards. So for people that don't have descriptors, they are cards with drawings on and then a saying underneath, so that you can look through them and go, do you recognise anything like that? Because they don't necessarily talk about feelings at all.
Yes.
They talk about situations. So then that gives you an indication as to what that feeling might be.
Yes, lovely. And I'm glad you say that, because like I say, that is what I do with when I consult with people, is I don't work necessarily at all on feelings. We work on, like I say, what happened to you this week, or, you know, what's important for you that you want to discuss, or, you know, so none of that, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Because we can't work on that. I'm just trying to see if I can find, it is difficult sometimes with the comment section to find the remainder of their comment. Hold on.
Another thing that might be useful is what I call noticing. So it's just noticing different things in your body. So like if you're hungry, if you can notice when you're hungry or when you're thirsty, so starting with the physical things, so that you gradually build up over, and it might take, you know, a long time to do this because you're becoming familiar. Things like your heartbeat. What's your heartbeat like when you're sat down? What can you feel that with your hand? What's it like when you've been moving around? So it gradually connects up, because what happens is we detach cognitively sometimes from our body, so that we don't know what those feelings are. But that doesn't mean that we're never going to know what they are. However, with alexithymia, it might be that you need to be taught that, say, for something like sadness, you might have had this experience this week, or you might have had this experience this week. For something like happy, you might tell us what you've done this week, and these are the things this is the feeling that you might have associated with that, so that you learn it from a cognitive perspective. So that's what happiness means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and lots of people are saying, you know, that they found this session actually, some really useful things and insightful. Estin is also, thank you, Estin, because I'm sorry, it cuts off half the comment for some reason when it's it's not even that long a comment. It's just on StreamYards, it only gives you a bit of it. So no need to apologise. So yeah, they said it wasn't so much a question, more a realisation that they don't need to learn to identify when they feel sad or happy, but that it would be more helpful if I had support figuring out ways that express what's going on inside me that work best for me. The way you just explained and that you all discussed yesterday. Okay, lovely. Yes. So Estin, yeah, like I say, for me, it is a lot of the time it is easier to just say I feel small because that is how I feel, or my head is really foggy, or today I'm really struggling to pick up my feet. It's like I'm wading through something really thick. That's what it feels like. I think lots of us as autistic people might be able to recognize that and validate, I guess, is quite nice, isn't it? Validation that if I describe to somebody, usually if they're autistic and I say I feel small and I try to explain what that means, they have some ability to empathize with that. I've tried explaining that to non-autistic people and I don't think they have the ability always to empathize with what that feels like. So I think having that validation can be quite nice, or just that mirroring that other people get it can be quite validating. So thank you for your comments, Estin. I think we've touched on everything. We've talked about actually and covered where to look for neurodivergent therapists. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that, because we've listed a couple of places.
Well, there's also the counselling directory. They don't actually include neurodivergence at the moment. I have been in contact with them about it to ask. There's not a lot of people that do say that they're autistic or neurodivergent, but it's always worth asking the question. Just ask them.
Yeah.
Are you autistic?
So and that's actually quite important, because it might be they don't feel safe actually to be openly a neurodivergent therapist. The stigma, for instance, and then that goes back to the ableism.
Absolutely. In training,
therapies.
The autistic people don't experience empathy, so therefore, how can you be a therapist?
Yeah. Very, very misunderstanding of what it means to be autistic.
If only they knew the amount of empathy that some autistic people experience.
Exactly. And I think what frustrates me as well is even when somebody's alexithymic, i.e. they really, really struggle to even recognise their experiencing an emotion, that is not the same as having no feelings and no empathy and no emotion. That's a whole other thing. That's a whole, and that's a very problematic narrative. I did think as well, as a little bit of self-promotion, you can literally, people in the comment section, you're welcome to just get it as a donation for £1. But one of my videos that I mean, obviously I'm biased, but it's a video that I find the most useful for people, for you to help you recognize some of the key things about yourself. So maybe you didn't know you don't think in pictures, and didn't recognize that that's a thing and how that might impact you. So I talk about some of those things in that session that I've just linked. Predominantly the purpose of that video is for mental health, practitioners of some description, to help them recognize the difference between autistic experience and psychological or emotional distress. I can't remember if I signposted you to this one, so I don't know if you have seen it or not, but it's my autistic wellbeing what works, basically. So if you are feeling like you're having to educate your therapist, will they watch my video, and then they might have that bit of background knowledge to then be able to use their skills and their tools in a way that might suit you better than if they're sort of coming from that place of imagining you're, not autistic almost. Oh, and somebody said, autistic people don't have empathy. Sometimes I wish that was true. Yeah. Any final thoughts? Did you want to talk a bit more on that ableism in therapist training, or any other key things that you were hoping to cover?
I just think it's worth people being aware that it does exist, and that if you're in training and experiencing it, or you're coming away from your training feeling that you're not enough, or that you're not doing something right, or that potentially that might be what you're experiencing. We had to do an exercise in eye contact when I was training, and we had to be able to look at each other, every single person in the class. We all had to walk past each other and look. Well, I just completely dissociated. I did what I was asked to do. Was it helpful? Of course, not at all. It was the only way I could cope with it was to literally take my brain offline, because that enabled me to go through it.
I did, as part of it was a bit to do with my sort of my PhD and things like that, but it was the Imagining Autism project at Kent, which was a really great project. It was to help young autistic people in a number of ways. It was a really lovely project, and I kind of went through their sort of training for people because I wanted to learn, because it was very very art creative based, and I wanted to learn about that. And they did have a session with a non-autistic person who got the small group of us who were, you know, wanting to learn. We had to do this thing where you had to dance with one another to like a 4-minute piece of music, maintaining eye contact. And at this point, I wasn't actually diagnosed, but I'd recognized I was autistic, and it, you know, that I was already processing and going through that discovery, or starting that discovery journey. So I was in a really kind of emotionally difficult place anyway. And I remember doing that, and I remember saying to my dance partner, I said, I'm not going to be able to look at you at all. I will be looking at the floor. And I just wanted the floor to open and swallow me. It was the most uncomfortable, distressing thing. And I remember running out, having a little cry, and just beating myself up about it, because I was like, why can't I do that? Why can't I do that thing? Right. And yeah, so that internalized, again, ableism and things, but it was distressing.
It sounds like it was agonizing.
It was awful. It was so awful. And I was just like, I don't have to be here. I'm leaving, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. How can you look into someone's eyes and continue talking about the subject? It's impossible. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's one of the things that is so ingrained into us, isn't it? You know, making eye contact, and particularly in therapy. You know, so I mean, one of the things that when I was working face to face, I went into the room that I've got, and the seats were set up directly opposite each other. So I just changed them and put them at an angle.
Yeah.
Because I think actually most people would probably find that more comfortable.
Yeah. Particularly when you're being so emotionally vulnerable. I think.
Well, it's like staring into your soul. Oh.
Yeah, awful.
Yeah.
And similar things. So if I would have an autistic student come to my office, wouldn't sit opposite them, and I would see that they were anxious or uncomfortable, or just having to, you know, wanting support, and they just looked distressed. So I would hand them a fidget object, had a little box of fidget objects. I've had my fidget object, and then we're not talking to each other, you know. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you know, getting to focus on something else and not that exchange made it a little bit easier for them to be able to actually communicate.
I always have fiddle toys. I've got one in my hand now. It's amazing.
I know. I want to know about this one, actually. So I feel like this is a nice natural place to end. So thank you so much for your time. Because yeah, definitely, I always go over. I can't help it.
Boundaries.
I know. This is the thing. I mean, the thing that's interesting, it's boundaries, but it's not because I don't want to do the thing or whatever it is. It's the I'm enjoying the thing. I want to carry on doing the thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's in terms of my spoon management. I need to be better with my spoon management. So our final question that we ask everyone, which is, what is your favourite stim? Unless it's different, I would like to know, or if it's different, what the thing is that you've got, actually.
What I've got here.
Yeah.
Oh, this is Chloe. This is amazing. This is, I think it's just called a Magnacube, and it's magnetic. Nice. Listen to that. Can you hear that?
Yes, lovely.
And it, yeah, it's you like, literally.
I do that with, so these are magnetic rings, and you're supposed to be able to do tricks with them, but I don't, it's not about the tricks, it's about the push and the pull of the magnets and the pinging.
I mean, this, I just love it. Look, it just watching it fit in so succinctly to there. I couldn't see, but
you couldn't see
what
it,
can be more, what can be more satisfying than that? And it just
slots in fantastic.
Yeah, but my other go-to is a raggedy old tea towel.
So what is this? So you did say this. Oh,
yeah.
Ask the no, not yet. So we're not ready yet. Hold on. Sorry, this is an in joke. I will explain in a minute. You might have seen it yesterday. So what's the thing with the towel?
It's when I was very young, I used to take a tea towel. So what some people might call a like a comforter.
Was it a tea towel or was it like a terry cloth? Is that what you mean?
Oh no, it was a tea towel.
It was a tea towel, like you would do the washing up with.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it had to have a unsewn edge on it that was quite hard, because I just played with it and just literally fold it in my fingers. But it had to be washed in Persil with comfort and dried on the washing line.
For a particular smell?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And now, I mean, I've managed to change the washing powder now. I use Surf or Fairy sometimes if I'm really pushing the boat out. But yeah, it's that taking me back to that time when I had that comforter. And yeah, the feel, so it's all sensory related. It's the feel of it, the smell of it. And it's just my favourite go-to thing. But I obviously don't do it in public because that might be a bit embarrassing, a 49-year-old.
You would be able to do it in our autistic spaces. And
I would, wouldn't I?
Yes, we would ask all the questions. We'd want to know why it's so lovely and what do you get from it and stuff. I love sharing stims. This is why we ask this question. I love hearing about people's stims. I think it's a lovely thing to talk about and share. Oh, yeah, so Roberta, yes, the smell of laundry dried outside. Okay, Si, okay, hold on. I do love it. Poor Victoria, who's also one of our Aucademy modmins, is like, do not ask that question. Ban Si from the banners. So the question is, for those of you who aren't used to this question in Aucademy, I'm sure most of you are by now, mayonnaise or salad cream? That is the question.
Well, there's a definite intonation there that I'm going to say mayonnaise because it says, and why mayo?
This is because Si is team mayonnaise.
Yeah, see, and now there's this part of me that wants to say salad cream because you're making an assumption that it's going to be mayo.
I love it because Si is also PDA as well. I love it. So avoiding the demand. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. So actually, it is mayonnaise, but only because salad cream contains onion derivatives and I can't have onion. So if it didn't, it would be salad cream because I prefer it.
Fantastic. Okay, that's an acceptable answer. Thank you. Yeah. And then our fantastic James, who made the fantastic PowerPoint on the history of salad cream, which was so impressive. It's like salad cream for life because we're the underdog rebels. I'm still quite pleased when there's not too many salad cream people because I think if there's an apocalypse and I'm hoarding the salad cream, I'm not going to have to fight so many
You're not going to run out.
No.
However, you can't have tuna without mayonnaise.
No, mine's with salad cream.
Is it? So yeah, I'm not a fan of. Yeah, I don't like tuna and salad cream. Only tuna and mayo.
No, it's fantastic. I love it with salad cream. It's great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Stay on for me while we do the outro, and then we'll just have a quick catch up. Not catch up because we've been here the whole time, but you know what I mean. When we finish.
Debrief.
Yes, that's the one. Thank you. That's the word I would have wanted. Thank you everybody so much. I found this session really helpful. So I'm pleased that it helped a number of other people. I'll collect some of those things from Angela. There's no rush, but you know, any of those things that you might want to link or suggestions, I can make some infographics maybe. to support people as well, to look for things in terms of therapy and so on and so forth. And for everybody, next week, so next Saturday is the 25th of September, and we have the lovely Nick Walker back on. So she's going to come on, and she's talking about, interestingly, I won't know enough about this, neuroqueer life and literature, and basically neuroqueer, so being autistic, for instance, or neurodivergent or neuroqueer in some capacity, but in the literature. So like when you read fiction, and things like this, which I think will be really, really lovely and very, very interesting. So thank you everyone so much, and we will see you all soon.